I'm David.
I'm Max.
And I'm Joanne.
And we at Nootralize will help you engineer happiness and cognitive performance in your experience.
I'm a retired psychiatrist who has been investigating frauds and quackery related to health for about 50 years. I've practiced psychiatry until 1993, and since that time I've been writing and investigating health frauds and quackery on a full-time basis. I do it as a public service.
What is quackery?
There are many ways to define it. The one that I find most useful is the promotion of false information, overclaim in the field of health related to gaining something, usually.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us
it
one example?
It has mostly to do with pseudoscientific claims, in other words, far-fetched claims.
Right.
And if it's done deliberately, I would call it fraud. If the person is a true believer, I would call it quackery. And sometimes you can't tell which is which.
Right. And it can also be hard to tell which is which between pseudoscience and science, right? Sometimes.
It depends. If you have scientific training,
right,
it may be easy. Sometimes, I guess, if you're given claims that are not in the field in which you are trained and knowledgeable, you may have difficulty deciding. But if you happen to have the right background, you usually can see through them fairly easily.
Right. But for the average consumer of health products who probably doesn't have a scientific background, how should one go about finding the difference between pseudoscience and science?
I'm not so sure that's the way I would approach it. I would approach from a different direction as to how to judge information.
Okay.
And a lot of it boils down to basically who you're going to trust. How do you decide? Well, we have about more than 50 tips on the quackwatch.org website that talk about signs of quackery.
Right.
If somebody, for example, says, I base all of my claims on testimonials, I have all these people that say they've been helped, that would be very suspicious. If somebody says, I think everybody should take vitamins, that would be suspicious. If somebody says, well, the scientific community is out to suppress my methods, I mean, that's a guarantee that there's something wrong. There's no such thing as suppression in the scientific community. So we have about more than 50 of these kinds of tips. So you might call them the voice of the quack, or how you can be suspicious. Then there's the issue of certain kinds of claims that should be challenged. We recommend, if you're looking for information, that you try to decide in advance who you trust, and that you go for this information to one of the major sites from the government, or from major professional organizations, or major voluntary organizations. Doing blind searches with Google to try to seek answers usually does not work well, because it's really not difficult to put up convincing arguments for people who are not, who don't have a background in that particular area.
But the average consumer will probably, even though they have this in mind that they shouldn't go to these websites and should prefer to listen to good authorities, let's say, the average consumer will probably still arrive at those other websites for specific purposes that aren't necessarily easily treated by conventional medicine. So how do you, in such a case, examine such a site
Well,
for its
trying to examine claim by claim is not a good method if you don't have the background. And I can't, for some areas, I can't tell whether some of the claims are true or not. And I've been looking at claims, most of my professional life, probably as much as anybody on the planet. And there are lots of times when I come across claims where I'm not sure whether they're true or not. I can recognize some that are not true. And if I find any, that makes me highly suspicious. I much prefer to go to sites of places that I trust. I trust the government. There are many things wrong with our United States government, but when it comes to health information, most of the government agencies are quite accurate. The FDA is a marvelous source of good information.
There are some problems with many of the interventions and medications that people are recommended and prescribed by these authorities, though.
And the problems of the medicine that's approved are not fakes. They may have side effects, and it's up to the prescribing physician to weigh the potential benefit against the risks.
Right.
And there's no such thing as a risk-free medication. Most treatments have some risk, and the idea is the likely benefit greater than the possible risk. And if something can't meet that standard as a drug, it's not usually going to be FDA approved. Now, once in a while, it turns out that new evidence comes up and the drug will be given the drug maker may have to make a warning or may have to withdraw it. That's not, that's part of life. It's not a reason not to trust the FDA
right.
Approval process.
Right. And I wasn't critiquing it at all. I was trying to lay the ground for helping people who want to add to their FDA approved treatments. If they want to add treatments which aren't FDA approved,
I would be skeptical.
Right.
Generally speaking, if you're actually offering a treatment that's not FDA approved, that's probably going to be illegal. And why would you want to operate illegally? If you have the evidence to support something, you should, why not operate legally and get approved?
Right. There are a lot of interventions and treatments that simply don't have enough research backing their efficacy, though, because that research just hasn't been done yet, and it may in some cases even be happening right now. How do you think people should act in such cases?
You say that there's evidence, but it's not enough. That if something's legitimately experimental, it ought to be tested in clinical trials.
Right.
But it might be useful to get more specific, because most of the kinds of treatments that would fall into the realm of quackery or pseudoscience are not drugs at all. They're vitamins, minerals, homeopathic remedies,
right.
Herbs, and there's they don't require FDA approval to be sold. You have to be careful what claims you make, but the question is, if somebody makes a claim, is it based on evidence, and what's the nature of the evidence? And right. I don't recommend that consumers try to evaluate the evidence. If something is really useful, the scientific community will jump on it and discuss it and begin to study it and make their guesses as to whether it's useful. I mean, it comes up mostly in the area of let's say dietary supplements, where there have been a few that came along and where the scientific community thought that might be useful, and so eventually clinical trials were done, and lo and behold, almost none of them showed that under rigorous conditions, when you compare large groups of people who take the method to large groups that don't, turns out it doesn't work. With herbs, there's been a fair amount of research, but with there are very few herbs that are useful, and most of them for minor symptoms, not for the treatment of disease.
Right. I think that it would not be good for us to come on a podcast here and reaffirm our beliefs that the FDA approval process is right, and that any intervention that isn't FDA approved is not useful. Because I think that in general, sure, we can lay that groundwork and say, this is by and large how it is.
Well, don't forget that everything starts out as unapproved. And there
Right,
are many,
exactly. Yeah.
There are many things that are under legitimate investigation, and they have nothing to do with what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about are things that are not being legitimately investigated, and where the evidence consists of personal opinions by individuals who are selling this stuff. I mean, that's not a good way to decide, because what you have is tens of thousands of people selling stuff, saying, hey, it works, and I think it works, or I've seen it works, or I heard it works, or it helped me, or it helped him, or that's not evidence.
I agree that the level of evidence has to be taken into consideration when deciding what you do with your body. How can one assess the level of evidence? You mentioned earlier that you don't think that people should try to assess how accurate claims are and how good the level of evidence is. Yeah,
I think generally it would be good to find out if any recognized body has done the assessment. That would be, I mean, there are databases, for example, Memorial Sloan Kettering has a database about herbs. That's a pretty good place to go, because they tend to be, I would call it an unbiased site. They just look at what they see, and they have experts give their opinions. They cover hundreds of them, and that's probably the most accessible place to look for information about herbal products.
That's great. I haven't heard of that. Can you please send it to me so that I can include it in our show notes for our listeners?
I think it used to be called About Herbs, and it probably still is, but I haven't looked at it in the last few months.
Cool.
But in terms of levels of evidence, well, personal experience is one level of evidence. A doctor's report of anecdotes would be a level of evidence, and those are very, very low levels. Beyond that, there are things like a well-written case series, which may point to something that ought to be researched further. But and then it gets complicated, because there are now a lot of pretty junky journals that'll publish anything, and there are people who even post articles written in almost fake journals. They look like they were journals. May turn out they're not even journals. They just formatted that way. So again, it's better to go to the the sources that have the background to evaluate. I can talk about why personal experience is not, first of all, it may not be true, but assuming that someone actually is reporting accurately that, oh, I took such and such a pill and I felt much better. Well, how do you know that's not a coincidence? Maybe you would have felt better anyway. So in order to separate that, you have to do studies.
Right, but people could compare themselves, like within one person, n equals 1 experiment, before they used it and after they used it and after they stopped using it, and do such experiments several times over several years, and at least get to some degree of evidence of how it works for them, I think.
Stopping, starting might be a reasonable way to test something on yourself. One of the questions would be, how often is it appropriate to do that? Is that the best? If you have a problem, is that the best way to handle it? Obviously, in some cases it might be, in many cases it might not be.
Right, right. At which point do you think that anecdotes become more useful than randomized controlled trials? How many participants, how many anecdotes are roughly equivalent to, let's say, 100 participants, 50 in the placebo group and 50 in an active group?
How would that compare to anecdotes? Anecdotes, I think you'd have to look specifically at the situation, but in general, the best that anecdotes can do, if you have a lot of them, is suggest that somebody ought to measure it properly. But they don't compare at all. And
So,
I can tell you that you have to be careful, because anecdotes may be flat out lies. They may not have happened. It may represent wishful thinking. It may represent coincidental recovery in a condition that has ups and downs. So I would say anecdotes are worthless. And I've investigated a few anecdotes and testimonials. It's very difficult to investigate them, but once in a while I've done it and realized that it's just an outright lie. I can give you an example. I give you two examples. One was a woman who was promoting a method of cancer treatment at a Mexican clinic, and she said, oh, I had an invasive cancer of my large intestine, and they cured me with Laetrile, which was widely promoted years ago. And she waved around a copy of her pathology report to prove that she had an invasive cancer. And I got a copy of it and I looked at it, and she was lying, because the report said she had a polyp that had an invasive cancer, a cancer invading the polyp wall. That's not invasive cancer. And the way you cure it is you just snip it off and the person is cured because it hasn't spread. So she was taking it, boasting that she had a treatment that was treated with Laetrile after she was cured by just snipping off the cancer. That's one example. The second example, more interesting, is Dr. Lorraine Day, who claims that she cured her cancer with prayer and dietary supplements, a special diet, and a few other things. And she put on the internet a copy of her pathology report. The only problem is that she didn't put a copy of the report that matches what she says. She claimed that she had a tumor the size of a grapefruit, and that the surgeons opened it up to relieve the pressure, but left it in place and sent her home to die. The fact is that she didn't put up the pathology report, and if she had, I believe it would have shown there was no cancer, but she won't disclose it. So I'm absolutely certain that she's lying.
I see. Well, let's define an anecdote then. What's your definition of an anecdote?
It's simply a, um, a single case report, generally one that's not, it's a story. It's a case report of by an individual, generally not very well, usually not a very detailed report.
Right. How would you rate the level of evidence of a survey online, which, let's for the relevance of it, say that it is a psychometric test, such as the profile mood state is what it's called.
You're talking about mood?
Profile of mood state.
Mood state?
Profile of mood state, yes.
MOOD. Oh, if a person, I mean, that's not mood is not a disease.
Right.
And lots of things can change people's moods.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody says, I did such and such, and I felt good, lots of things make people feel good.
Right.
It's not a disease, it's not a disease, and it's not clear whether that is a treatment claim. You can also, well, I'll let it go with that. You have more questions, I'm sure, on that.
Yeah, I do. So let's say that someone does this profile of mood states survey online on a website, and they do it every day for a year. And during every other month, they alternate between using an herb such as ashwagandha. How useful is that evidence? Let's say that 1,000 people did that. How useful is that evidence of those 1,000, maybe you want to call them anecdotes, versus 100 people in a placebo-controlled trial?
Well, are you discussing something theoretical, or has it actually been done?
It is theoretical, but we are investigating how useful that evidence could be for
But
actually.
It might. That, I mean, that's not a bad way to collect information.
Right.
It has its pitfalls, but it might
Or
be.
those.
It might point to value, and it would be best if that it got studied in a more rigorous way. But if you can get it wouldn't have to be 1,000. I mean, 100 would probably be a pretty good piece of data. The problem is that it's hard when you do something online. It's hard to be sure the person is telling the truth, but that kind of data might turn out to be useful.
Right. I think that you can never be certain that someone is telling the truth, even if they're included in a placebo-controlled trial.
No, that's not true, because the thing that it may turn out to be a question of what you're measuring. Some things can be measured with tests that are not subject to what the person wants to believe. So if you're talking about something that's a subjective, that is what a person feels, and you select, if you have two groups of people that are similar and they don't know what they're getting, then that pretty much takes care of the question of whether or not they're telling the truth. Because the odds, there's no reason to believe that if people are randomly selected and put into groups, there's no reason to believe that one group's going to report any differently from the other. So that's why a controlled trial is more valuable. But for preliminary evidence, if you have 100 people and they simply keep a diary and report what they did, the chances are, though, that, I mean, the data could be fairly interesting. It might very well turn out to be useful. But
Right.
you also have to be concerned about, what is it they're doing, and do they have any side effects, and
Right.
what's their overall situation if it's relevant. I
Yeah.
mean, mood is something that is very, very changeable,
Right.
and there's also the question of, if somebody, let's say, what are we talking about? Someone who's depressed. If you're depressed, it's better to try to do something about the source of the stress or depression than it is to take a pill. I practiced psychotherapy primarily, and I prescribed very little medicine. I dealt with what's depressing you and what can you do about it. And for mild to moderate depression, counseling and psychotherapy are way better than any medication, because even if you can suppress the symptom or control the symptoms with a product, it's better to do something about the cause.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Other than confounding factors, what are the pitfalls with such an internet survey methodology?
No, I think that the kind of study you're describing, where somebody does something on and off, let's say for a year, and there are 100 people doing it, I think that's pretty good data. Would it be better than a controlled study? No, but it's less expensive to do.
Right, exactly, and more people can do it because it's available online, and they don't have to go into a research facility and so on.
Yeah, you run into the problem that it may turn out that the people who are inclined to do it are people who are biased one way or another. So there's no control. But as I say, it's somewhat the equivalent of a case series, and 100 would be a pretty good number. I don't think you have to do 1,000. It wouldn't. I don't think if you have any more. I don't think 1,000 would have any more significance than 100.
I see. So if there is a compound, an herb, let's say, that is currently being researched in randomized controlled trials, but there isn't enough evidence to have it be FDA approved, but there is this evidence online of let's say 100 people collected in the way that I described earlier.
Over a year's time, nobody dropped out?
Certainly people are going to drop out, but hopefully if we implement this in our application that we're developing, then hopefully we'll have even more than 100 people. So there will be 100 people that do.
I think it's something that could be seriously considered.
Right.
Would it be better? Again, no controls, no, not better. But,
yeah, I agree.
But significant. But it probably would be significant.
Right.
Except that, again, why are they taking it? Is there a problem with their mood? And is that the best thing for them? Even if it turns out that it can affect their mood, there's also the question of whether it's the best way to deal with whatever it is they're trying to deal with. And I would also ask whether this is something that people are looking to have simply normalize their mood from being depressed, or try to feel better than normal, if there is such a thing, maybe a little euphoric, or
right.
Is that what they're trying to do? And how does it influence how they live or their success in life? I mean, a lot of questions.
Right.
We're talking theoretically, but I'm saying that kind of a study or that kind of data, I would say it would be significant. Would it be the last word? No, but it would be significant. And I think it might have some value to people who are considering using it. However, in considering using it, it would be, what are the possible harms, and is that the best way to deal with whatever problem I'm trying to solve?
Right. Quackwatch.org is where people can find you, correct?
Quackwatch, that's where I hang out.
Quackwatch, yeah. Any other source you want to link to in our show notes?
No, that's sufficient. We have about Quackwatch actually is a network of 24 websites with over 7,000 pages, probably about 50 complete books, many articles.
Right. Thank you, Stephen Barrett, for coming on the Nootralize podcast.
Okay, you're welcome.
All right, thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Nootralize podcast. But please remember not to take anything that we said as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. And before you start experimenting with nootropics, please get the basics of biohacking right. So that is your sleep, your exercise, your nutrition, and mindfulness. They are gonna get you much farther, much faster in terms of optimizing cognitive performance, happiness, or any other goal that you may have with your experience in engineering. But when you want to start experimenting with nootropics, our app will be a great place for you to start. Based on hundreds of placebo-controlled human studies, we give you a nootropic recommendation personalized for you. So all you have to do is go into the app at beta.nootralize.com, link in the show notes, and enter the effects that you're looking to get from a nootropic. You can add up to 3. So let's say you want to improve your mood, you want to protect your brain, so neuroprotection that is called, and you want to improve your attention. So you add mood, neuroprotection, and attention to your search for a nootropic. And then you click search and you'll have a nootropic recommendation at your hands based on hundreds of human placebo-controlled studies that we've gone through for you. And we'd love it if you leave a review on this podcast with some honest feedback. And other than that, thank you very much for listening once again, and see you next time.